Almost 3 years have passed since Russia's special military operation in Ukraine began in February 2022. But the conflict continues without any signs of abating. The situation between the two countries is increasingly tense. Ukraine is actively launching attacks on Russian territory, while Moscow is also showing off its military power at the Kursk front. Given the prospect of an escalation of the conflict, many international experts fear the possibility of a nuclear war in the near future. As for Western countries and NATO, Russia's nuclear warnings seem to be just passing words. Despite the many red lines set by the Putin administration, the West has repeatedly crossed them without any serious consequences. Since the conflict began, Moscow has repeatedly asserted that the West's violation of this limit could lead to Russia activating its nuclear arsenal. However, despite the West providing Ukraine with advanced weapons and Kiev's repeated attacks deep into Russian territory, from airports to even the Kremlin, Russia has not used nuclear weapons. Most recently, Ukrainian forces launched an attack on Russia's Kursk region and seized part of the territory. However, despite the escalating tensions, Russia has maintained its stance and has not used nuclear weapons. This has led Ukraine and NATO to believe that President Putin and former President Medvedev's threats of a nuclear war were just a means of pressuring the West. However, on September 12, the situation changed dramatically. Putin warned that if Ukraine used long-range missiles provided by the US, UK and France to attack deep into Russian territory, Moscow would consider it a direct involvement of NATO and would respond accordingly. This could be Russia's last red line. Following this statement, Russian experts agreed that the West should take President Putin's warning seriously. Washington is also forced to be more cautious in allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons. Journalist Sergei Shokin commented that Russia is very dissatisfied with the fact that the West no longer seems to be afraid of the prospect of nuclear war. He also compared the current situation to the Cold War era, when the fear of nuclear war pushed the parties to sit at the negotiating table to control and limit the conflict. In response to a reporter's question about the final red line, Putin made it clear that if cruise missiles produced by the UK, France, and the US were used to attack Russia, Moscow would consider it an act of war by NATO and would respond appropriately. Hardliners in the Russian government are also increasing pressure on President Putin, asking him to demonstrate Russia's nuclear power, reminding the West that Russia is still a nuclear superpower. Russian media have also mentioned options such as cutting diplomatic ties with Britain, a NATO country that Moscow considers its #1 enemy, or conducting nuclear weapons tests in the Novaya Zemlya region in the Arctic. Former Kremlin advisor Sergei Markov has even suggested that Russia could attack NATO air bases in Poland and Romania if Ukrainian F-16s are used to attack Russian territory. The current situation forces both sides to face the fact that, if the West continues to cross Russia's red lines, the possibility of an escalation of the conflict, including the use of nuclear weapons, is inevitable. The world can only hope that the parties will exercise restraint and seek a peaceful solution before the conflict turns into a global catastrophe. Some experts believe that Russia will only use nuclear weapons in the most urgent situations, when national security or the survival of the Russian state is directly threatened. However, recent changes in military policy may significantly change the conditions leading to Russia's use of nuclear weapons. Accordingly, Moscow may lower the threshold for the activation of tactical nuclear weapons, turning them into a tool in local military conflicts, instead of just a preventive measure in life or death situations. Another change being considered is that Russia could use nuclear weapons not only to defend the existence of the state, but also when its strategic interests are seriously threatened. This opens up the possibility of Russia launching a nuclear strike on countries that do not possess nuclear weapons but are allied with nuclear powers. If those countries engage in military action against Russia, This escalation of tensions has led many to fear that nuclear war could break out at any moment. According to a recent survey conducted by the Levada Center, the fear of nuclear war has increased significantly in Russian society since the conflict with Ukraine began. Between a quarter and a third of Russians surveyed said they were afraid that nuclear weapons would be used in the near future. Alexei Levinson, an expert at the Levada Center, stressed that this fear is second only to concerns about the safety of themselves and their families. Meanwhile, Alexei Arbotov, one of Russia's leading security experts, said the West was making a grave mistake in believing that Russia would never use nuclear weapons. He said that at some point, nuclear weapons would be used by Russia, despite the risks of escalation and global catastrophe. Arbotov also warned that the West was underestimating the pressure Putin was under from military hardliners, such as Sergei Karaganov, who have openly suggested that Russia launch a nuclear strike to remind the West of its destructive power. It is also worth noting that, in Russian politics, President Putin may be the most moderate of the current leaders. Without him, the more hawkish views might have pushed for drastic action earlier. Currently, some officials in the Russian military and security establishment are dissatisfied with Putin's restraint and are questioning why Russia has not yet used nuclear weapons. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is escalating, and signs that the West may directly enter the war have begun to appear. If this happens, it is very likely that President Putin will approve strong countermeasures, including the use of nuclear weapons. Hopefully, all sides will find a way to restrain themselves and move towards a peaceful solution. Because no one wants a nuclear war to break out or Ukraine to become a radioactive land. Clearly, the world is on the brink of a crisis that could push humanity into disaster. Crossing Moscow's red line will have to be carefully considered. And hopefully all sides will make efforts to find a peace agreement to avoid going to the brink of World War III. The prospect of nuclear war is unwelcome. But the current situation is increasingly fragile and unpredictable. Ukraine's repeated crossing of Moscow's red lines, with strong support from the West, has pushed the conflict to a more dangerous level than ever. Meanwhile, in Moscow, hardline voices are growing louder. They argue that Russia cannot continue to play defense and needs more drastic action, even a nuclear warning strike, to force the West to stop. Some figures such as Sergei Karaganov have openly called for the use of nuclear weapons to remind the world of Russia's power and fear. This has put enormous pressure on President Putin, who is now trying to keep the conflict from spiraling out of control. At the same time, Russian media are also signaling the possibility of a more drastic response. From cutting diplomatic ties with NATO countries like Britain to conducting the first nuclear weapons test since 1990. One of the sites being prepared for this is the former Soviet nuclear test site in the Arctic. Novaya Zemlya? Former Kremlin advisor Sergei Markov has also warned that Russia could attack NATO air bases in Poland and Romania, which are believed to house Ukrainian F-16s. This could create a direct escalation between Russia and NATO, a prospect that both sides have tried to avoid so far. Against this backdrop, the question is whether the West will continue to challenge Russia's red lines or will it refrain from pushing the world into nuclear war. Although many Western experts and politicians still believe that Russia will not use nuclear weapons, changes in Moscow's military strategy and growing internal pressure make this scenario no longer impossible. Ultimately, what the world needs now are diplomatic solutions to de-escalate tensions and end the conflict in Ukraine. Both Russia and the West are well aware of the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war, not only for the warring parties but for all of humanity. However, without a peace agreement soon, this scenario could become more realistic than ever. Now, it all depends on whether the parties can find common ground to prevent further escalation of the conflict before it turns into a global nuclear catastrophe. The survival of the entire world depends on the restraint and wisdom of the current leaders. With the threat of nuclear war looming, The biggest question now is whether the parties can control the situation before it spirals out of control. Russia, under pressure from hardliners within its own ranks, may be forced to take more drastic measures if the West continues to supply advanced weapons to Ukraine and shows no sign of backing down on the conflict. The West, meanwhile, is faced with a difficult problem: how to support Ukraine without provoking Russia into using nuclear weapons, with both sides escalating the conflict. The risk of a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO is real. Actions such as attacks on NATO military bases or nuclear testing would be a tipping point that would make the situation extremely dangerous. A nuclear war would not only devastate the war zone but also threaten the safety of the entire world. Experts warn that if nuclear weapons are used, even as a show of force, they can easily escalate into an uncontrollable all-out war. Negotiations and diplomatic solutions are more urgent than ever. World leaders need to work together to find a way out of this crisis. Lessons from the Cold War and previous conflicts show that, in times of great tension, diplomacy and negotiations are the only way to prevent a global catastrophe. All sides need to cool down, refrain from military action and seek dialogue instead of pushing each other to the brink of nuclear war. A ceasefire, even temporary, can help create the necessary space for the parties to sit down and find a long-term solution. Dialogue is the key to avoiding crossing red lines and preventing the darkest scenario that no one wants: a world destroyed by nuclear weapons. However, this requires both Russia and the West to put global interests above short-term political goals and power struggles. In short, the world is now at a critical crossroads. International leaders must recognize the importance of managing conflict and avoiding the prospect of nuclear war. The decisions that come will not only affect the fate of Ukraine and Russia, but also the stability and security of the entire world. This poses a huge challenge, but also opens up the opportunity for a peaceful solution if the parties can overcome tensions and find a path of dialogue. Only restraint, clarity and a commitment to peace can prevent catastrophe and put the world back on the path of stability. Ultimately, the best hope now is that the parties will soon realize the urgency of reducing tensions, moving towards reconciliation and reaching a peaceful agreement, not only for their own benefit but also for the stability and safety of the entire world. The future of humanity depends on wise and clear-headed decisions in this perilous time.